You're listening to the Mentionables Podcast. I'm Joel Furchess.
And I'm Nick Peters.
And we are...
The Mentionables.
Yeah, haven't done that intro in a while. I figured I'd bring it back. So we're interrupting our Mentionables Conference podcast series for a special-ish post-Easter episode. Really post-Easter at this point. There's plenty more conference material to get to in the upcoming weeks. Hey, Nick, you're a loyal listener. I'm sure you've been keeping up with all the talks and panels from the conference.
We had a conference?
Yeah. You did a talk there, if I recall.
Not the one in Texas.
I know. That we missed you, Nick. We missed somebody to make fun of.
That's because you all don't take good aim.
But that's all right. We did talk plenty of smack behind your back.
Good. I hope someone also gave Tyler a hard time to make up for me.
Don't worry, we got that covered. Anyway,
Good.
We'll be getting you more audio from that conference soon in upcoming mentionable episodes. But today, Nick Peters and I have decided to sit down and talk about a video posted by internet atheist Paulogia. How do you like that name, Nick?
A little bit creative, but that's about it.
Sure. I guess his name was Paul, and he decided to roll with it. So, Nick, your visibility as an apologist has risen considerably since your debate, which we featured on this podcast. And since Tyler's debate at the conference with Aaron Ra, he's very particular about the pronunciation of his name. We recently aired that debate here on the podcast. Anyway, Tyler's getting a lot of attention as well. The Mentionables may just be realizing the goal of getting some of these lesser-known names the recognition they deserve, right?
Right, and that's part of the goal, to get us out there and recognized. And that includes any number of other up-and-coming apologists that are working to get recognized.
Right, and then we can change our name to The Mentioned. My wife's always wanted me to change the name. Anyway, we'll assess the video in a second, but first, it's time for a little love song, worship song.
Is it a love song? Is it a worship song?
Okay.
You remember the rules of the game?
Yes, I do.
All right, so here we go. First song. Here are the lyrics. Here I am, once again, I pour out my heart, for I know that you'll hear every cry. You are listening no matter what state my heart is in. Pour out my heart to say that I love you. Pour out my heart to say that I need you. Pour out my heart to say that I'm thankful. Pour out my heart to say that you're wonderful. That's the song. What do you think?
I'm gonna go with a worship song on that one. Maybe the idea of you hear everything I say. That sounds like a prayer song.
Okay. It was. It's Pour Out My Heart by Matt Redman. So that's a ding, ding, ding for that one. All right, next one. Here are the lyrics. For so long, we've been finding each other for so long, and the feeling that I feel for you is more than strong. Take it from me, if you give a little more than you're asking for, your love will turn the key. I would wait forever for you, build my world around you, watch and see. If you give a little more than you're asking for, turn the key. I just want to be your everything. Open up the heaven in your heart and let me be the things that you are to me and not some puppet on a string. Oh, if I stay here without you, I will die. I want to be laying in the love I have to bring. I'd do anything to be your everything.
I'm gonna go with a love song on that one.
And it is. The song is I Just Want to Be Your Everything by Andy Gibb. So far, so good. We have 2 songs to go. All right.
Okay.
This one's going to be a little longer in lyrics, but you'll survive. Here are the lyrics. Treated me kind, sweet destiny, carried me through desperation. To the one that was waiting for me, it took so long, still I believed. Somehow the one that I needed would find me eventually. I had a vision of love, and it was all that you've given to me. Prayed through the nights, felt so alone, suffered through alienation, That's a big word for a song. Carried the weight of my own. Had to be strong, so I believed. And now I know I've succeeded. In finding the place I conceived. I had a vision of love, and it was all that you've given to me. I had a vision of love, and it was all that you've given to me. I've realized a dream, and I visualized the love that came to be. Feel so alive. I'm so thankful that I've received the answer that heaven has sent down to me. You treated me kind, sweet destiny, and I'll be eternally grateful. Holding you so close to me, prayed through the nights so faithfully, knowing the one that I needed would find me eventually. I had a vision of love, and it was all that you've given to me. I had a vision of love, and it was all that you turned out to be. The end.
I'm going to go with Love Song.
And it is. That was Mariah Carey's Vision of Love.
A love song. A love song.
All right, last one. You're doing great so far.
I don't think I've ever missed one of these. I hope I don't jinx myself.
No. Caleb, who I've done these with, who I started doing these with, had a perfect record for a while, but I got him to trip up. All right, last one. Sitting at your feet is where I want to be. I'm home when I am here with you. Ruined by your love, enamored by your gaze. I can't resist the tenderness in you. I'm deep in love with you. I'm deep in love with you. My heart, it beats. I'm deep in love with you. Humbled and amazed that you would call my name. I never have to search again. Here's a deep desire that's burning like a fire. I know you as my closest friend. My love for you is deeper than it was yesterday.
Ooh, that's tough.
I know,
tough.
right?
I'm going to go with Worship.
All right, and you are correct. The song is Deep in Love with You by Michael W. Smith.
I could sing of your love forever.
Yeah, it's a really sad commentary on the church.
Yep. Way to nail the worship part, Michael W. Smith.
Mm-hmm. Join us next time when we discuss if lines come from a worship song or 50 Shades of Grey.
Whoa. Brah. Okay, so the video we're looking at today is titled How Christianity Probably Began, No Resurrection Required. Right away, that title has to get at you, considering that arguing the resurrection is kind of your thing, right?
Yeah, it kind of is, although my last debate I did move away from that a little bit, just get to the existence of God.
Yeah, that one really surprised me. I was like 100% sure that you were going to pull out the argument from the resurrection. And then you went with Aquinas' 5 ways. And that was a bold move, my friend.
Mm-hmm. That's exactly what I did. I figured that would be one he'd be least suspecting.
Excellent tactic. You seem to be passingly familiar with him.
I might have read Richard Dawkins' interview on them in The God Delusion. That's probably about it.
Yeah, okay. That seems about right, remembering back on that. All right. Well, anyways, Paulogia begins his video. I'm going to laugh every time. Begins his video.
You can just say Paul.
There you go. Paul. Yeah, because that's probably his name. Begins his video by saying the basic historical facts used to argue for the resurrection are as follows.
When presenting the case that Jesus rose from the dead, the Christian will often point to a set of historical facts which generally boil down to Jesus was crucified, people claimed he rose from the dead, and now the church exists.
Off the start, that's incredibly wrong. A number of things. First off, that Jesus was crucified, and he definitely died by crucifixion. That's at the start. I'd also add one of the main facts not agreed by all, but with great evidence behind it, I think, is that was buried in a tomb. And then I think if he was buried, that tomb had to be found empty. And not people claimed he was raised from the dead. That's one thing. But people, especially his own followers, and skeptics like Paul and James, claimed to see him alive after the Easter event.
Yeah. No, I mean, claimed that he rose from the dead seems to oversimplify the thing. And it almost seems like it's leading a leading summary rather than kind of...
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, anyway, I'll be interested in hearing your development of that argument near the end here, but the only question I have to ask is, do you think he's being fair right here, or is he deliberately making a straw man?
I don't think that's being very fair. I think you need to present the case for your opposition honestly as best as you can. That includes we Christians. When we're presenting an argument from our opponents, we need to try and present in the best possible light and use the principle of charity. If an interpretation could make their viewpoint look better than it is, and it's a valid interpretation, we should go with it.
Yeah, I agree. We should steel man if we're going to make the argument.
Mm-hmm.
Straw man almost shoots you in the foot right off the bat.
Mm-hmm.
All right, well, let's start going through his argument.
Around 30 A.D., the Middle East was littered with apocalyptic preachers, including one Jesus of Nazareth.
Is this accurate?
There would have been a few. John the Baptist, for instance. And there was someone who showed up around shortly before the destruction of Jerusalem claiming that the temple was going to be destroyed, and likely believe he was killed by a stone at just that time and such. So there was a lot of apocalyptic fervor going on, that sorts. And unfortunately, people often get this kind of thing so horribly wrong. You read Bart Ehrman's Jesus, Apocalyptic Prophet of a New Millennium, and throughout that whole book on end times and Christian positions on end times, he never once mentions, and I'd actually predict this as I started reading the book. I wish I could have made a bet or something on it, but he said he never once mentions Orthodox preterism as an example of how to interpret these texts. He reads them in the same fundamentalist mindset he apparently did back when he was a Christian.
Yeah, that's symptomatic of a lot of atheists, is that they take a very literalist interpretation of Scripture, and they assume that all Christians do as well. So it kind of shows you where they came from.
To be fair, also, I don't think Ehrman would describe himself as an atheist, more as an agnostic.
Yeah, probably. Although I think he kind of waffles on that a bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
All right, so the next point. So how would Jesus compare to other apocalyptic preachers of that time period? Is he pretty standard for the day, or does his message have something that separates it?
Jesus was very unique. I mean, he didn't really go around challenging Herod and such all that much. There was no indication he was raising an army. He had a ragtag bunch of fishermen and tax collectors and such behind him. Hardly the force that's going to take on a lot of these people that were claiming to be the Messiah. They'd raise up an army, and then Rome would come, shut them down, game over, the end, move on to the next guy. And then, of course, there's Jesus' teachings. Jesus taught about the kingdom of God. N.T. Wright said his message is pretty much the exile is over. And Jesus centered the message really on himself in such a unique way. And it's really hard to say what's unique about Jesus, because you just don't know where to begin, because everything about him is radically unique. And there's a reason more books have been written about him than any other figure.
Yeah, Jesus spends a lot of time talking about, the kingdom of heaven in his his speeches, and he always he starts with, the kingdom of heaven is like, and then he gives some kind of example or parable. It's interesting because you have all of these people who are trying to make him just kind of step up and be a king and challenge the authority and overthrow Rome and all that stuff. They really want him to do that.
That could have, in fact, been why Judas Iscariot betrayed him, for all we know. I mean, we don't know for sure, but maybe Judas said, okay, maybe if I put him in a situation where he has to rise up, he will rise up. We don't know for sure, but he could have. That's
an interesting point. But the contrast there is that people are trying to kind of force him into this position of becoming king, and, every time he does something miraculous, he's like, yeah, but don't tell anybody that I just did that. And, John the Baptist sends him, are you really going to be our Messiah? And he's like, you tell him what you see. The lame are healed and the sick are healed, the whole thing, and the gospel is preached. And so it's almost like he's saying, no, you guys have it wrong. This is what the kingdom of heaven looks like, not the other thing.
Right.
So, yeah, I would say it's different.
The kingdom of heaven is pretty much going to be when the effects of sin are removed. But if you want to see what the kingdom's going to be like, there's going to be no sickness, death, and not only did he heal people of physical ailments, he also enabled them to take part in the societal rituals again. That they could go and interact with people, because lepers, they were outcast at the time. But when Jesus was done, the leper could go and be a part of the community again.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And, what comes to mind here is that it wasn't just people who were trying to push him to become king. In the wilderness, Satan himself is going, well, I'll give all the kingdoms of the world to you right now, and he denied that.
Yeah.
All right, well, let's go with the next point.
As was a standard Roman practice for the crucified, Jesus' body was thrown into an unmarked grave outside of town.
Are there concrete reasons to believe the biblical text is historically accurate on this account, or is Paul's argument, which I believe is endorsed by Bart Ehrman these days, a possibility?
It's interesting that, I interviewed Greg Manette on my podcast about this, and Greg Manette is actually doing his PhD on the burial of Jesus. And he points out that Ehrman does not interact with specialists in Jewish burial practices in the first century in the area of Judea. Now, some people say that where the Romans didn't allow cultures to have their own practices and such. This is true outside of, it's true only outside of the area of Judea. There was some leniency granted for the Jews with their practices. And so when someone died, burial would take place because the body had to be buried even if it was of a criminal, because that was something that could defile the land, potentially. If you have someone who's just buried in an unmarked tomb, like a common grave or something like that, a dog could come and dig up the body, or a piece of a body and such. A bird could take a piece of skin. Anything could happen. And that would all go back, that could go back to the temple and defile everything. So, first off, he doesn't interact with any of these people. Jody Magnus is one example of someone he doesn't interact with. And I think that's particularly interesting because Jody Magnus teaches at the very university that Bart Ehrman teaches at. And I understand that she was also hired by him to teach. So why Bart Ehrman doesn't do that, I don't know. It doesn't make sense to me, really. I consider that a grave oversight on Ehrman's part.
A grave oversight?
Yeah.
Classic.
I think there was... Yeah. And I hadn't even thought about it, but now that you mention it, it is pretty good.
Yeah.
But, I mean, we also have the case of Johanan, someone who was crucified, and we even found the nail in his tomb, in his foot and such. So we know that he died the same way, and yet he was buried. So I don't think there was a lot going on here on Ehrman's side to back the case. I think if you go with purity laws for the Jews and such, there's a better case that Jesus was buried.
Okay. Sounds good. I like that. Yeah, and the Jews had very, very specific, practices when somebody dies. They have to get that body in the ground right away.
Mm-hmm. They did. It was all about purity. It didn't matter if a person was a criminal or not. What mattered most was purity. And if there was contamination, that was not allowed at all. Interestingly, the person who would be responsible for burying Jesus would be the ones who were responsible for his death. And I think this is likely what Joseph Arimathea did. He saw an opportunity and just decided to take it.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
I also think it's
the Sanhedrin were responsible for his death, essentially.
Yes. And I also think the accounts aren't something that would be made up, because Jesus' burial was a shameful burial. His family isn't allowed to be there to mourn. He's not buried in the tomb of his family. And I think the guards were there mainly to keep mourners from coming by. Now, you can say Joseph and Nicodemus tried very hard to help out there by, putting all the stuff on the tomb, on the body and such, but it's like putting a Band-Aid on a gaping wound. It just doesn't work.
Yeah.
So it's not the kind of account that we've made up. And also, in the early church history, not a single opponent ever denied the burial of Jesus. All of the gospel accounts agree on this point, and that's not something that should be taken lightly.
Right. All right. Well, now Paul jumps to the hallucination theory.
Devastated after the death of his mentor, Peter may have suffered post-bereavement hallucinatory experiences, or PBHE, a well-researched phenomenon documented in papers like these. With PBHE, a lonely, low-mood, fatigued, anxious, bereaved person without history of mental disorder will have an abnormal sensory experience. In about a third of the cases, the individuals will report seeing, hearing, and talking to someone deceased.
Paul escapes the whole mass hallucination problem by saying that it was only Peter who experienced the hallucination, and that he just convinced everyone else. What's your take on that argument?
I say the earliest source that we have, the Creed in 1 Corinthians 15, indicates no such thing. It indicates mass appearances. It indicates appearances to Peter, yes, but also to Paul and to James, to the apostles and such. And really, you have to think, ancient people were really so stupid that Peter would say, hey, I thought I saw him, and no one would say, oh, let's go and check and see if he was buried here. Let's go check the tomb or even the common ground. And no one else would be willing to look and investigate this further. They'd just go by one man's appearance. And look, I'm married to a woman I love very much who struggles with hallucinations. And you've studied some psychology, so what I'm going to tell you is not new to you. Usually when a hallucination is done, you know it was a hallucination. You don't need to be convinced of that.
Yeah, that was what I was going to say, is that when somebody has kind of one of these grief visions, which do happen occasionally, they wake up and they're, and this cruel reality hits them, and they're like, oh, immediately they realize that this was just wishful thinking, this was a vision, and, sometimes you get this in paranormal things, people come, oh, he came to me, or my grandmother came to me and said everything was going to be peaceful and all right, and, that they think of this more like a dream or, some kind of revelation that they get from beyond the grave. At no point do they think, oh, she's not dead. She's right there.
Yeah, you never see them go and decide to dig up the body and anything like that. I mean, some cases might be exceptions. For instance, I've got an aunt back in Knoxville, and she's in her 90s and such. Her husband passed away maybe a little over a year or so ago, and she's thought she's seen him a few times, but she's also in the stages of dementia. There's no indication the disciples were in any such stage like that.
Yeah, and if they did, they'd probably think they saw a ghost, because, hey, they thought Jesus was a ghost when he was alive and walking across the sea.
And as N.T. Wright says, if they just have that kind of vision and such, they would think that Jesus had been assumed to Abraham's bosom, Instead, but like some sort of divine exaltation, they would not be saying resurrection.
Right, because like you have this story in the Old Testament where kind of Samuel appears to Saul from beyond the grave, and Saul's not like, oh, God raised him from the dead. Cool. He knows that he's seeing a vision from beyond the grave.
And I don't think that Peter and the apostles believed that Moses and Elijah had been risen from the dead when they saw them conversing with Jesus.
Yeah, good point. All right, well, anyway, Paul then goes to the telephone theory.
Or Peter merely decided that Jesus' message of the coming kingdom was too important, and that he would take it upon himself to spread it in the wake of his mentor's death. At some point, Jesus' brother James joined the cause, along with one of the Johns. Stories about Jesus began to spread, not primarily by Peter, but rather through the person-to-person evangelism of the day. Neighbors talking to neighbors, merchants talking to customers. These conversations were meant to recruit new followers, not relay an accurate oral history. So in the telling, details were expanded upon, embellished, or even invented each time they were recounted. As the movement began a life of its own, Peter the fisherman was not around to personally affirm or correct the tales being told.
I guess we need to address both the telephone theory and also why we have reasons to believe that there were multiple eyewitnesses. And we kind of covered that, the passage that you cited from Paul.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the telephone theory, when people do this, they just really don't know how the ancient world works. Word of mouth was much more reliable than people realize. They had to use their memories. We don't, so we don't take it as seriously. There was an idea, I'd like to get a book someday called The Gutenberg Galaxy about this whole idea, I think. Because, see, I was here when Gary Habermas spoke at, I think it was Georgia Tech here, a couple of years or so ago, and someone asked him during the Q&A, well, geez, if all this stuff is true and what's happening, why didn't someone just write it down immediately? And, for most of us today, that makes sense, honestly. Most of us would think you would write it down because we often assume so much of the past was like the present. So, like, if today people might say, why didn't they just send an email or something? That could happen in a few years. People might say that kind of thing. But what I do when I tell you this is, Joe, let me do this with you. You hypothetically live in the ancient world at the time of the Easter event, whatever it was, and you're convinced Jesus rose from the dead, and you want to get the message out. You have two ways you can do this, okay? One way is through oral communication. Now, here are the perks of this way. It's free. It reaches everyone who speaks the language. Anyone can pass it on easily. And it's got a good, reliable track record doing this way. Now, here's writing. Okay, you can do that one. Perks are, it's unchanging. Anyone can see it, although writings can be altered at times and such. But here are the downsides. It costs a lot of money. For instance, just writing and delivering the book of Galatians back then would have cost $500 today. It can only reach people who can read, or those who can hear the readers, and it takes a whole lot more time to write something than it does to speak something. Now, which way are you going to go with?
Well, I'll tell you what, if I saw somebody I cared for rise today, the first thing I would do is start telling people, and then I might blog about it.
Yeah. Now, if you live in the ancient world, we all know what you do. You'd start telling people immediately because writing is a less effective way of reaching the people than it is today. And it wasn't the case that one person said one thing to one person, that one person went to one person. These things were told in stories, in groups, and the groups would come together and discuss the events. And normally there'd be people in these groups that would be kind of like the gatekeepers, as it were. I think they're often called the tradents. and they would make sure the story was being told accurately. Now, you could have a little bit of minor variation in details, but the main thrust had to be the same. One analogy I give is, let's suppose Mormons or Jehovah's Witnesses come and visit my wife and I. I've got two people I'll usually call after a visit. I'll call my parents, because, like parents, they want to know what their son's doing. And especially if it's an apologetics endeavor, I'll share with them how it went. I'm giving the basics. Then I'll call my father-in-law, Mike Lacona. Since he's a New Testament scholar and studies this a whole lot more seriously, I can give a really different account of the same event, both of which are truthful. But I can go into greater detail with Mike because he does know the issues a whole lot better. Both accounts are true, but they vary depending on the audience.
Yeah, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So after that, Paul starts working on Paul's conversion.
A few years later, a Pharisee named Saul was traveling around persecuting these new Christians, burying the moral guilt of his actions under the certainty that he was doing the will of God. But on his way to Damascus, he suffered a psychotic break, possibly some form of guilt-induced post-traumatic stress, manifesting in a vision of the allegedly resurrected leader of the group he was harming. So affected by this experience, Saul changed his name to Paul and began recruiting for Christianity and writing letters to churches outlining his theology.
Paulogia is not the first to come up with this theory, so talk to me about that.
This is again assuming the modern world and the ancient world, where everyone was based on an internal guilt system. In the ancient world, it was an external shaming system. Picture King David. David has this affair with Bathsheba, calls Uriah back, tries to get him drunk so he'll sleep with his wife, doesn't work, has him killed, and marries Bathsheba, baby's born, end of story, everyone's happy. Except God's not too pleased with what happens. When in the story does David admit his guilt?
He admits his guilt after Nathan comes to him and gives him that little parable.
Yeah, once Nathan says him, he gives him the external shaming of the great words of, "You the man." That's when David says, "Oh, okay, I'm guilty." There's no indication Paul had anything like this. In fact, the only time we really read of him giving a testimony is in Philippians 3, and it's a testimony about his life before becoming a Christian, and where, he was on drugs and alcohol and rock and roll and all this. No. His life before he was a Christian actually looks pretty darn good. You don't see anything like that. I mean, yeah, he does say he persecuted the church and things like that, but there was no indication that he was facing any guilt here. Now, maybe Paulogia doesn't go this route and just says psychotic break, but you need to have some evidence of this. The book Young Man Luther really did a whole lot of damage to the theory of psychohistory. He said, my wife has a number of conditions and such, and it took years before we were able to find out what the main ones were and such, and that's with her right here in front of us being examined and questioned by trained therapists and psychologists who could ask her questions and such. And even then, it's hard. It's much, much harder to diagnose someone 2,000 years ago in a different culture, time, place, and language. And furthermore, when my wife has had those psychotic breaks and such sometimes, afterwards, everything returns to normal, and she realizes, yeah, I wasn't in my right mind. And in my own past, I used to have panic attacks and such. And in the heat of a panic, you get so scared, you're convinced you're going to die from anxiety. And then whenever your other fears what time is, you're not going to die from anxiety. Now, after it passes, you can usually talk to someone calmly about it, and get things worked out some. That's the way psychotic breaks can work a lot of the times. I'm not saying that's the way it is for all of them, but it can sometimes. And really, there's nothing in Paul that indicates that he was mentally imbalanced in a severe way or such. His writing and thought is very, very well put together and such very organized. He's a great commander of intellectual arguments.
All right, so let me talk about this a little from my perspective. So the two theories I've heard in regards to Paul's vision and conversion and so forth is that either what you said, he was having some kind of guilt complex, or that he had an epileptic fit and just kind of hallucinated the whole thing. Now, as far as the first one goes, generally speaking, when somebody is taking radical actions like, hunting down a people group and then tormenting them, I don't know if he was literally killing them or torturing them. I'm not sure what he was doing to them exactly, but whatever it wasn't pleasant. Typically, the mind justifies the actions. So if you were to do something impulsive without really thinking about it, then you would go back and you would justify those actions. The actions were not motivated out of any kind of consideration or thought, but after the fact, you have to somehow come up with reasons why what you did was justified. So, for instance, one of the instances in which you'll see this is with hypnotic suggestion. And, you see those stage acts where the hypnotist will get the person to squawk like a chicken or so forth. The interesting thing about that is that when somebody places a hypnotic suggestion in somebody else and then they do the thing, and it works, the person will return by coming up with what to them is a good reason why they did that. So after the fact, the mind is like...
By the way, thanks for that large donation you just made to us.
Uh-huh. Anyway, the point is that you justify after the fact. So you'll see this with divorced couples. Somebody has an affair and then they get divorced, and then the person who had the affair will go back and say, yeah, I only did that because you had this, that, and the other wrong with you, and the marriage was very unhappy. Not necessarily true. It was an impulsive thing they did, but they have to justify it after the fact. My point in saying all of this is that Paul would be more likely to come up with very good reasons for doing the things he was doing, and then kind of double down on those reasons and stick to his guns, than to just kind of suffer some kind of deep guilt about what he was doing. That's just human psychology.
And now, Matt, we're still reading kind of modern individualistic psychology into the ancient past there, when we should recognize that this is much more of an agonistic culture centered on the good of a community, where the community gives you your identity. They're much more, your focus of your identity is outside of yourself, not within yourself.
Right. So as far as the epileptic fit thing, here's the thing about epilepsy. You don't remember anything about the fit you were having. You can have the whole seizure and then wake up, and somebody would have to tell you you just had a seizure, because in your mind, you were just sleeping and you woke up, or everything was okay and then suddenly you're on the ground. The period of time during which you were having the seizure is missing time for you. So there is no possibility of somebody having epilepsy or an epileptic fit and then hallucinating during that period of time. Hallucinations and epilepsy aren't even paired together. At best, you'll have foggy memories that you can't really bring back, kind of like a deja vu experience. It's like you remember something, but you can't quite, get your hands around the memory itself. So again, it's just kind of missing time with sort of a vague impression.
Or it's kind of like when you do have enough internet atheist arguments enough, and you start having a deja vu experience.
Yeah, well, prepare to have more, because now we're going to talk about Galatians 1.
You know what a deja vu experience is, don't you?
No, tell me.
You know what a deja vu experience is, where you think you've seen this before.
Anyway. All right, so Paul has an epileptic fit. He thinks he's seen Jesus. And then, in the scripture, Paul says it to the apostles. Compare his gospel with theirs. And so Paulogia says,
Paul, Peter, and John once met in person to swap ideas, but in the end they didn't actually see eye to eye on things.
But Paul says that, in Galatians 1 and 2, they did agree. So which do we trust, the Bible or Paulogia? And by the way, where do you think he's pulling this idea that Paul and the apostles disagreed? Because he just says that in the video. He doesn't give it any kind of citation.
I have no idea. Really, some people do think the super apostles Paul wrote against in 2 Corinthians might be the original 12. I haven't seen backing for this, but it's interesting when you read Galatians, because in Galatians, Paul has his identity pretty much on the line. Is he an apostle or not? And there's something very revealing in the first 2 verses. Let me see if you can catch this. Paul, an apostle, not from men nor through men, but through Jesus Christ and God the Father who raised him from the dead, and all the brothers who are with me, to the churches of Galatia. Did you catch it?
And all the brothers who are with me, perhaps?
Exactly. Why would that be important?
Maybe that everybody who was with him agreed with him?
Yeah, Paul is saying, hey, I'm not a lone wolf. I'm surrounded by several people, and they will back my case if they need to. And Paul is discussing events that he says also, such as calling out Peter in Galatians 2, that took place in public. You're not going to do that if people can come forward and say, hey, I was there, it didn't happen that way.
Yeah, good call. All right, well, let's just jump to the next point.
A great many Gospels were written. Each author who compiled a new version expanded upon Jesus' power and his divinity, going from a preacher who did miracles only under very low profile to the co-creator of the universe who performed publicly at the drop of a hat, to someone who killed and resurrected people out of spite, to a powerful resurrected military man with an anthropomorphic giant talking cross as his sidekick.
And he throws out the infancy narratives in the Gospel of Peter to show this progression. Just for the listener's sake, the Gospel of Peter ain't in your Bible. Continuing. We do agree that John was written later, and that it definitely puts emphasis on Jesus' divinity more overtly than the other Gospels. Basically, his point is that as the Gospels roll off the pen, they get more elaborate over time, and he's throwing in these apocalyptic books as well. So do you think he has a point?
Okay, where by infancy narratives, he means the infancy Gospels, and not, say, the accounts in Matthew and Luke.
Yeah, I think you're right. He's talking about how there weren't originally these infancy narratives, and then they start... Yeah, that's probably what he's saying.
Yeah, but the thing is, how do you have progression going on here? Because the accounts are, in some ways, very similar and such, and they're also very different. And you think if the church was trying to make this up, suppose Luke looks at Matthew and says, oh, I got to improve on that. Why would he write an account that so many scholars today think totally contradicts Matthew? I don't think it does, but a lot of them think that there's a whole lot in Luke that's not in Matthew. There's a lot in Matthew that Luke never even mentions. And if we're talking about these Gospels getting more progressive and such, well, why weren't these later Gospels been included in the canon at all? I think if you're making stuff up, you'd have no problem with this. And for those who don't know, the Gospel of Peter ends with kind of what I prefer to think of as the Power Rangers, Jesus, where you have 2 giant angels coming out. I'm surprised you know about that since you said you never watched it at all.
I just know about the Gospel of Peter, the resurrection.
You have 2 giant angels coming out, and in between they've got a third guy, presumably Jesus, and his head goes beyond the sky and such. And a cross comes out of a tomb, and a voice speaks from above, have you spoken to them that sleep? And the cross says, yea. That's the Power Rangers Jesus, because eventually every creature in Power Rangers usually, or most of them, they usually become a giant at the end. So that's where I get that from.
That's his final evolution.
This whole idea about, that's his final form. This whole thing really seems pretty false, because if we're going to go with the accounts becoming more and more progressive, where the first account we have is in 1 Corinthians 15. You have appearances to Peter, to Paul, to James, to the 12, to all the disciples, to 500. There's 6 appearances right there. Okay, now let's progress further. The next one usually thought to be is Mark. And in Mark, you have appearances to...
No one.
No one! And then in Matthew, you have the women and the apostles. So, I mean, you see, things seem to go backwards then, because the most elaborate account is in 1 Corinthians 15. Now, you could say where the story is a lot deeper in the Gospels, and maybe you could indeed argue that, but if you're going by just the number of appearances, 1 Corinthians 15 wins.
Yeah, so what I would say is this idea of inflation of the Gospels, the things he is pulling out here are more related to the audience to which the Gospels were written. So, my friend J. Warner Wallace, when he sits a witness down and has them just on the spur write out every event that happened to them that day, they're not really writing to an audience. They're just trying to accurately record whatever it is that they did that day. And that's just a police technique. Mm-hmm. But when the Gospels were written, they were written to people. Possible exception might be Mark, because Mark was written to the church in Rome, where he's just kind of writing down the sermons of Peter, to the best of our knowledge. Mm-hmm. And so it was less written for an audience and more written like sermon notes. Mm-hmm. But then you have Matthew, and Matthew's is really an apologetics to the church in Israel and Jerusalem. So he's writing to the Israelites about why Jesus was actually their Messiah. So he's focusing a lot on things that concerned his Jewish audience. And so there was a different focus, and he pulled different stories out, and he kind of emphasized different things in the stories, because he's telling, like, well, this one time Jesus did this thing, and that fulfilled the prophecy that we see here. So he's very focused on the fulfillment of prophecy throughout his book. So different audience, different take on the stories.
Right.
And then you had Luke, who was who was a historian. He was trying to write it in the best history sense that he could, making citations and trying to peg the time during which these events took place based on who was the high priest. So he's just trying to be a good historian. And then John was writing to a much later generation who was starting to buy into Gnosticism. And so those were the stories he was focusing on, things like the I am statements of Jesus and so forth.
Right.
So it's not evolution of the text, it's different audiences.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I don't have any problem with that.
All right. So that happened. And then Paulogia says that, quote, there are no historical or even biblical records that say that any of the 12 disciples died for their beliefs. All right. So that's what he says. Is he wrong?
Yeah, I really recommend he go look at the work of Sean McDowell, who did his dissertation on this with his book, The Fate of the Apostles. We have some sources for Peter, Paul, James, and I think Sean McDowell says Thomas is actually very reliable. That's where I might have said the same about John. Don't remember entirely. But yeah, we do have some problem. Now, if someone says, for instance, that aside from, say, John, all of the apostles died as martyrs for their faith, that you're not going to find good evidence for that one, unfortunately. Now, you won't find any evidence that any of them recanted their faith, but there's not the same amount of evidence that all of them died for their faith.
Yeah, I mean, you get accounts from, say, the Catholic Church in their various traditions about the deaths of the apostles, but there's not a ton of resources backing up the most of those traditions.
Right. Again, Sean McDowell's book is the best place to go. And on my own podcast, the Deeper Waters podcast, I interviewed him on this topic.
Cool. Everybody, Nick is the host of the Deeper Waters podcast. You need to check it out. All right, continuing. So he laid out this scenario, right? And his scenario was that Jesus died, was buried in a mass grave. Peter.
I was about to say, gosh, that took a weird turn. He died and then he was born. That was some fantastic work he did.
It's a miracle. All right. He died. He was buried in a mass grave. Peter was really sad, and so he thought he saw Jesus. He told everybody. They believed him. Then Paul had a epileptic fit and thought he saw Jesus and began writing all of his Gospels. And after that, the Gospels were kind of inflated over time as people added details to them. And I guess that was basically his theory. Now, at the end, he says,
everything that happens in this origin story I just told is fully consistent with the way first century Rome operated.
So would you agree with that?
No, I would not, because first century Rome did grant leniency in the area of Palestine, assuming it was peacetime. Now, when they decided we're sick of the Jews and started to conquer the Jews in around 70 AD or so, peacetime rules no longer applied. Throw anyone in a common grave or you want, they didn't care. But I mean, even when Pilate tried to bring insignias of the Roman Empire and such into Jerusalem, he had to have them removed because that went against their views on idolatry. And the Jews did not have to sacrifice to the emperor in their temple. They sacrificed for the emperor. And also add in that Christianity was also a very shameful movement at the start. You had a crucified Messiah. You had bodily resurrection. You had exclusivism being taught. So many other things. If you were making up a religion in the first century world, Christianity is a textbook example of how not to make up a religion.
Oh, yeah. I mean, if it was popular, then people probably wouldn't be dying over it.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So then...
consistent with basic human nature, and consistent with the spread of every other past and present world religion, most of which you do not think receive supernatural help to get where they are. Every aspect of this story is mundane, boring, and exactly what you would expect.
So what would you say in response to that?
I'd want to know exactly how he thinks these religions spread, because Christianity have a danger of being exclusive, and also in a Gentile society. Larry Hurtado, I interviewed him on this one, on his book, Destroyer of the Gods. Very good book on how Christianity changed the world entirely. I mean, to have a Jewish person believe in a Messiah and abandon any Greek gods they might have been following, which is very unlikely, that's one thing. But to convince Gentiles to do the same thing, other religions, they didn't really require you give up all your gods necessarily. You could just add them to the pantheon. Christianity did not do that. There was only the Holy Trinity, Jesus, that was it.
Yeah. So as far as how other religions spread, all right, we got 5 main religions. Let's start with Hinduism. Hinduism started out as a bunch of tribal gods that sort of added together into what started out as a pantheon. But of course, over time, pantheons just don't sustain themselves because there's too many contradictions in there. And so the way that Hinduism solved the contradictions is they just kind of made this, reality is an illusion and that there's this great wheel of karma and rebirth. And so at that point, all of the gods just kind of became rebirths of previous individuals. And, if you get reborn and you get your karma XP up high enough, you get to be a god too. And so it's just a bunch of ascended individuals. So that made a little more sense, and that kind of solved the pantheon problem. And then it was just, it was in that regional. It was regional. It was a regional religion, and it really hasn't ever spread beyond that region. You know, as the population of India improved, the religion got spread via propagation. But yeah, it hasn't been a successful religion in terms of spreading across the globe. And the same is essentially true of Buddhism. Buddhism's sort of the same story, and Jainism and all of those other copy and paste of pantheistic religions.
And Judaism really isn't an evangelistic religion.
Heck no.
Too much.
They want people not to become Jews.
And Islam, it had a very good evangelism technique. The sword works extremely well when spreading a religion and such. About the next closest comparison we could have would be Mormonism. But Mormonism did live in a society that was much more live and let live. Now, some Mormons did get persecuted, true, but they could go to areas where they wouldn't be as persecuted, such as, going all the way out west to Utah and such. And there were added perks for being a Mormon.
Yeah.
Polygamy.
About that.
For instance. Yeah. Yep.
So I would say the success of the Latter-day Saints, if you can call it success, is because of the success of Christianity. It just kind of, it's like a parasite. It sort of attached itself to Christianity. It looks like Christianity. It talks like Christianity. And so, it just kind of gets rolled into one of these denominations. So, you're a Baptist, you move out to Utah, the Mormon church is there. So you go to, your local church, just happens to be Mormon, and you think it's just another denomination. And people still treat it like that. Same thing with Jehovah's Witnesses. A lot of people just see it as another denomination of Christianity.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, at the basis point, he's saying that religions start out because some guy gets some kind of divine revelation. He either makes it up or he hallucinates it, and then he just sorts of starts preaching it, and people follow him. The end. And he's saying that this is essentially the same thing happened. Peter had a hallucination. Paul had a hallucination. Convenient about that they both had the same hallucination. But oh well. Anyway, and they were both great orators or something, and therefore the Christianity spread.
Yeah, fishermen have such a great reputation for being great orators,
Oh, yeah. But anyway, so he says, now, the next point he makes is that the Gospels are anonymous, meaning, he says that they don't have any signatures on them. Nobody says that I, Luke, am writing this to you, Theophilus. It's just they're anonymous, so how do we know that these were written by the people that everybody says they were written by? So, any thoughts about that?
Jesus and the Eyewitnesses by Richard Bauckham has some interesting material, especially in reference to Mark on this, to show that the source was Peter. And the early church is pretty much unanimous on the authors of the gospel. And they're not people you would make up. You would not make up the tax collector writing a gospel, or this unknown Gentile that shows up in the epistles. And Mark is hardly someone you make up, because he's kind of this mama's boy who runs back home, and the first great Gentile missionary, and which later causes a rift between the church's two first great missionaries, Paul and Barnabas. So why would you go with Mark in that case? The only one that would give you prominence is John. And interestingly, that's the only one the church had any disagreement on. Was it John the Apostle or John the Elder? A lot of ancient works were really anonymous back then, and I don't even think this is a factor. I mean, we've got 7 Pauline epistles said to be Pauline, definitely, by pretty much every scholar in the field. 6 are disputed. All of them say by Paul, and yet they're still disputed. Am I to think that if the Gospel of Matthew said by Matthew, that Paulogia would just say, oh, okay, well, that settles it.
Yeah, so, I mean, all of the Gospels, there is no point in history where they were attributed to anybody other than the people who they're attributed to. Yes, there are no signatures in them, but that history of attribution goes all the way back, and it's not contested except for in the case of John. So, and in John we have Ignatius, who was the student of
Polycarp, you mean?
Yeah, Polycarp. Thank you for that. I wish you'd jumped in earlier and helped me with that. Anyway, so Polycarp was a disciple of John.
It's kind of cute to let you flounder a little bit.
Thank you. Ignatius was the disciple of Polycarp, and Ignatius said that John wrote them, and that's like a one-generation removed testimony. So it's pretty decent information. But, my arguments on them go briefly that here you have Matthew. Matthew was the tax collector. He's the only person who refers to the tax collector in the story by his Jewish name, Levi. None of the other Gospels do that. And that Matthew's Gospel, first, is very particular about money. So it's the one where the Lord's Prayer ends with, forgive thy debtors as we forgive those, anyway, it talks about debt and debtors. Forgive my debts as I forgive my debtors, kind of thing. And he also talks about the coin found in the fish to pay the taxes. And he gives the parable of the woman who loses the coins. And, you go through it and you keep your eye out for it. And he has a lot of money things in his text, which is interesting if it was written by a tax collector. And he also is the one that's harshest on the Jewish leaders, which would make sense if you were a tax collector in a society where the Jewish leaders were actively denouncing tax collectors as traitors and sinners. So, there's a lot of clues hidden in the text that it may have, in fact, been Matthew that wrote. So I have no reason to dispute that. Mark, we have a lot of early sources that tell us that Mark wrote it, and we can, it's pretty obvious the material at least came from Peter or from, people that heard Peter, because the book itself is very Peter-centric. He's kind of the main character there. It'll say things like, Peter and the disciples.
Aside from Jesus.
Well, yeah, there's that guy. But yeah, it'll say like Peter and the disciples went out and did things, and then Peter said this, and the disciples kind of chimed in. It's always kind of focused around Peter it'll also talk about them going back to the city in which Peter lived, and it'll say like, and then they went home. Well, it wasn't Jesus' home; it was Peter's home. Jesus lived in Nazareth.
And Barker makes the case that it's an inclusio account, that Peter is the first and the last apostle named.
Yeah, there you go. And then Jim Warner Wallace says that the book of Mark goes the easiest on Peter. Like every time Peter does something stupid, Mark kind of downplays it or, softens it a bit. So, for instance, when Peter denies Jesus, he immediately repents and starts beating himself up over it, and you just don't get that in the other Gospels. So even that event, it goes a little easier on it. So, yeah, there's decent evidence that Mark was written by somebody who had access to Peter. So there's that. And then Luke, it doesn't say who the author is in the text. What it says is that he's a historian and that he's interviewed or gathered sources. So you see him quoting Mark and Matthew, which makes sense if he's a historian gathering sources. And he has a lot of material that seems to come directly from Mary. In fact, he's telling us what Mary is thinking in his text. How else would he know that unless he talked to her, or at least one of her sons that might have gotten the information from her?
Well, some people would say that was made up and such, but that's for another episode.
Yeah, it's possible. It could have been made up. I'm not saying it wasn't. I'm just saying that, and I'm not going to argue that it was in fact Luke. The only thing I can really argue is that it was written from somebody who had access to testimonies, whether those testimonies were written down or interviews or something. Some of this was coming from testimonies. And then we've got John, and John is John. I'm not going to go into John.
Okay.
All right, so that talks about the anonymity of the texts. That pretty much finishes the video. So at this point, you're off the chain. We aired your debate on the podcast, and we got a response, one of our listeners, who described himself as a long-time listener. So,
Well, one of ours?
Well, this letter actually comes to us by way of Britain. I've actually read some good reviews about Britain on Yelp. 5 stars, believe it or not. One might even describe Britain as great. All right, so this comes from Adrian.
Wow.
And Adrian is from
But
Bristol.
it's gotta be great. The next Pokemon game's gonna have a region based on Britain.
Whoa. Pokemon even. All right, so Adrian's from Bristol, Great Britain, wherever that is. Okay, so here's his message. He says,
It's across some pond, I've heard.
oh, okay. So Adrian says, Barker really had nothing to offer. His comprehension of the Bible is pitiful. Do you know which conservative church he initially attended? Barker and I have many things in common, but most importantly, I share his atheism in regards to the God he references. His doctrine of God has little resemblance to God as revealed in Scripture, creation, and conscience, neither to God as confessed in the ancient creeds and confessions of the ancient church. He also displayed a remarkable gift of knowing what I know. He may claim not to God, but he certainly seems to claim some form of omniscience. Were I to meet Dan, I would ask him, given God, what attributes must he have? This test of his degrees of ignorance would give us a starting point. I would further ask if he is sincere in wanting evidence and what he understands is the gospel. Overall, Peters did a good job. He stood as a loving Christian, super academic references throughout, and charitable in his demeanor. Yours, Adrian. All right, Nick, anything you want to say to Adrian?
I'd like to thank Adrian for watching the debate and paying attention to it. It was my first live debate before an audience like that, of that nature, and I thoroughly enjoyed it. I'm hoping to do many more like this in the future. Going into the debate, I was a bit nervous at the start, going up and getting prepared, and I know it was on my head because it seems it was all arguments I dealt with all my life and such. But once I got up there and started doing the debate, everything was just fine for me. I was, as I say, in the zone. And I'm really glad to see people reaching out. And I hope that the debate will be shared with more people and will be discussed more. And especially in the comment section, that just gets more people watching and more people interacting with it. And that can only help. So, yeah, I also definitely agree that. And as far as I'm concerned, he didn't really have anything going. And I don't remember anything up there that made me go and say, I wish I'd really studied that issue a lot more, things like that. It was a lot of stuff. The most interesting time really was the Q&A for me. I know that most of it centered on the problem of evil, which I thought was very interesting.
Yeah, well, you got to come prepared for that when you're talking to atheists, because that's what they've got in the bag. Yep. They've got the problem of evil.
It's not where you were talking about how being cool and such up there. I actually think that's one area definitely where my having Asperger's actually helps very well, because it's hard in many cases to emotionally phase me with these kinds of things. It just doesn't work. It's a wasted effort in many cases. So I was able to remain calm. Now, my wife out in the audience, she was one to go ballistic a few times and such. But she knew she couldn't. Says, my man's up there. He has to handle that on his own. And, yeah, I actually got to have a break in the middle, and we all got to go to the restroom and things like that and such. And I did go see her, and my in-laws were there also to watch the debate. So I got to get their feedback. And plenty of people from my church showed up as well. A few from the Orthodox Church Arietans also. So I had a lot of good support there. But it just showed me that sadly a lot of atheists today, they don't really have anything except emotional appeals.
Yeah, usually the way an atheist wins a debate seems to be with confidence, with wit, and with one-liners that they can really kind of throw the guy down with. Because, honestly, that kind of stuff catches an audience's attention and keeps it. Firm, academic kind of arguments with citations and so forth, that can kind of, if it's delivered dryly especially, The kind of goes right off into the audience's head. The thing that they remember as they walk away was the witty one-liners and the guy that seemed most confident up there. Not to say that you weren't confident. You definitely were.
Oh, yeah.
All right, so Adrian, you asked about Barker's background. I'm actually doing a case study on Christians that became atheists, and I've looked pretty extensively into Barker. All right, so to give you a little bit of information about him, Barker actually comes out of the charismatic movement. He was an early convert at the age of 14, and he was already street preaching when he was a teenager. He was pretty heavily involved in the church, doing faith healings and speaking in tongues and so forth. Barker's real claim to fame is his composition of Christian songs and even plays. In fact, he is to this day receiving royalties. So if you want some really good music, you know where to look. So Barker became a preacher and took some theology courses at seminary, but he says he found the evidence for God to be really lacking, and he eventually deconverted. I was never able to find any specific points of conflict Barker had when he lost his faith. He didn't say, like, problem of evil, or, intercessory prayer, any of these things that you hear are real sticking points that kind of push people towards atheism. He just said he didn't find it convincing. That's all he has to say on the subject. And he even took a course in apologetics, and he said it just wasn't convincing. I guess everybody has their own experience. I'm kind of the opposite. I could see a circumstance under which I might stop being a Christian, due to evidence against Jesus or the Bible or such. But the evidence for God is so overwhelming, I can't find any way to see myself going full atheist. Which actually kind of relates to your arguments, Nick, because of the lawfulness, order, and reason that underlie the universe and human thought, which is so absolute. I can't see how reality works without a personal God undergirding it.
Right.
Nick, I was pretty sure you were going to go for the resurrection, and then you did Aquinas' 5 ways. What made you go... Oh, you said you would do that because you think it would catch him off guard.
Yes, and because I was there to debate the existence of God, not Christianity. And I just wanted to establish theism first, and when I want to establish theism, I go for the 5 ways of Aquinas.
Yeah, it's not a bad way to go. I salute you, sir. All right, so talking about debates, Tyler did a debate. It was one of our more recent episodes that we aired. He did this at the Mentionables Conference. And we got a response to his debate on Facebook from Ken.
How many times do you use the word sucks?
Well, let's count. I'll keep a counter going. All right, so he says that the audio quality...
I bet he didn't beat how many times I used it.
Yeah, well, we'll see. I'm guessing you never actually listened to Tyler's debate, did you?
I'm going to sometimes. You're probably like I have really bad insomnia one night and such and need someone to get me to sleep.
Sure. Sounds good. Actually, honestly, it was a really enjoyable debate. I listened to it a second time when I put the podcast together, and, it was really fun to see an aggressive, confident guy like Tyler going up against an aggressive, confident guy like Aaron. Those two going back and forth. It was really fun.
For listeners here on the Mentionables, we regularly, as guys, talk smack about one another, and Tyler was one of my favorite targets.
Yeah, I'm sure they didn't get that until you just told them.
Yeah, I like to make sure about things.
All right, so Ken says about Tyler's debate. He compliments the audio quality, says that it was better on the podcast than the live streaming. Ken, if you were listening to the live streaming through Facebook, the reception was really bad at the church, so we ended up having to restart the Facebook streaming, every 5 minutes or so. Through YouTube, it was a consistent stream, but the camera was located at the back of the church, so might not have been as good quality audio. But we also recorded it, so there's that. Anyway, Ken says, one possible answer to Aaron's challenge, blessed are those who have seen and yet believe. Jesus was speaking of testimonial evidence being preferred to visual testable evidence. Why? Because that was the problem in the Garden of Eden. Humanity was supposed to trust God in his truthfulness and goodness while surrounded by physical evidence of him being the creator. Jesus' resurrection was just a one-off like creation. All right. Who gets better fan mail, Nick or Tyler?
I say in this case, it'd probably have to be mine, since this time the fan directly said something positive about my performance. Tyler's fan, you could say that, just wanted to answer a question from Aaron.
So Tyler, or Nick's fan was in Great Britain. Where was your fan from, Tyler? All right, so I'm going to give a quick response to Ken here. When people pull out the old "Blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe" from the Doubting Thomas story, they almost always miss what's going on in this passage. Briefly.
By the way, let me index some of that quick. My wife's interested in the Orthodox Church, and some of the Orthodox Church says they don't refer to him as Doubting Thomas. They refer to him more often as Thomas the Believer. And I think it's an interesting point, because if we took a snapshot of everyone at the worst moment of their lives, we probably all come out looking pretty bad. So I understand why we say Doubting Thomas, but I think it might be better to say Thomas the Believer from now on.
You know, honestly, tagging onto that point, when Easter was here, I actually went and read through all 4 resurrection passages in Scripture. And something that really struck me when I was reading through those was how much skepticism was involved among the apostles or the disciples. Mm-hmm. Every one of the resurrection passages, we'll go with passages, in Scripture has a couple, if not most, of the disciples being really skeptical about Jesus coming back. They don't believe. They have to double check. And so the Doubting Thomas story is just a much more detailed telling of one skeptic among the disciples. But that's not what I'm going to get at here. So John is writing to, I said this earlier, 3rd or 4th generation Christians after the apostles. And his book, if you look at it, and even his epistles, they really tend to stress the eyewitness testimony. And he's stressing this to his reader, that Jesus was a real person and that he really did rise bodily from the grave. And he's trying to present this testimony as evidence that the faith of their fathers was grounded in a real person and real events. And just, as a side note, Gnosticism tended to teach that Jesus came as a spirit, not as a physical being. So, he's got a very tactile emphasis in his gospel. John, the beloved disciple, rests his head on Jesus' breast at the table. And there's a whole lot of touching going on. Anyway, so the Doubting Thomas story serves a very important purpose in the book, because Thomas was a skeptic who was convinced by overwhelming evidence, including tactile evidence. When Jesus says, "You have seen and so you believe, blessed are those who have not seen and yet believe," he wasn't talking to the other disciples. They had already seen Jesus. Thomas was the only one who hadn't seen Jesus up to that point. So he wasn't talking to Thomas and saying, these guys are more faithful than you because they believed and they didn't see. No, they said, "We've seen Jesus," and they came to Thomas. They saw him, in the book of John, it talks about how they had all touched him too. So when he says that, who's he talking to? Well, he's talking to you, the reader, at this point. John, the author, is essentially saying through Jesus' words that here was a skeptic who saw and touched Jesus. You, the reader, have some solid testimony here. You personally haven't seen Jesus, but you can rely on the testimonial evidence and believe because of it. What do you think, Nick?
That works for me. I don't remember what he said, but I know of a church or Origin, as some might call him, did have a statement about this. I can't get it right now. We're getting ready to move and all my books are packed up, so.
That's all right. You don't have to look something up for me right this moment. You can write an article and we'll publish it on the website later. Cough, that's probably not going to happen, cough.
Okay.
All right, so that's it for this Mentionables episode. As always, consider following our Twitter feed at Mentionables1. Sorry, that's at Mentionables1.
Wait, we got Twitter feed too?
We got everything, bruh. Check out our webpage and all the articles, merchandise, audio, and video there. That's thementionables.org.
We've got a webpage?
For now. While you're on the webpage, hit the donate button. All proceeds go towards conferences, although they might start going towards this podcast. Anyway, the conferences have been excellent so far, and we want to keep them up, possibly more frequently than once a year, depending on funding. We're trying to rotate from...
And further proceeds could also go to support many families in need, namely ours.
That's the one. All right, we're trying to rotate our conferences from East Coast to Central U.S. to West Coast. Invite us, and your venue might be the next to get a visit. We'd like to visit colleges and universities in the near future, too. And, I wouldn't mind getting out to see this Great Britain place I hear so much about. We'd also like some...
I hear you have to just go across a pond to get to it.
Yeah, it's on the other side of a pond, I hear. Should take a canoe or something.
Mm-hmm.
We'd also like someone other than Tyler to do some debating, right, Nick?
Right. I mean, someone's got to go up there and do a good job after all.
Yep. All right, we've been the Mentionables.